Welcome to Obstacle Running Adventures.
Speaking of obstacles, I saw that, and this might have just been in the more recent race, but I heard that the Z wall was transitioned back into a regular traverse wall. Is that true for the SoCal race?
Yes. So yeah, it was just a straight wall, which I thought was really strange because the corner and not being able to see where your next grab was part of the challenge. So yeah, there for the SoCal race, it was just a straight wall. They changed up the grips a little bit. Some were still horizontal, some were vertical on the foot too. So that was like a little bit of extra challenge that I think people hadn't seen before. I'm fortunate enough to have a gym where they make everything super, super hard. So when we do the Spartan obstacles, I'm like, whatever.
That's great.
Um, but yeah, so it was just a straight, it was very odd. Um, and the wood was rough, so there was more grip to it, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
It had a little more grain to it. It wasn't quite as slippery as the other Z wall.
What was like the overall sentiment of that? Were people like to complain, but were most people complaining about it? Did they address it and say like, this is something new that we're going to be going back to, or something old we're going back to?
I didn't really hear a whole lot of feedback about the Z-Wall, and they had it set up there in the festival area for people to try for the new format. Um, I did hear quite a few people say it was much easier.
Hmm.
But other than that, no, I didn't hear a lot of complaints. I complained because they put on Stairway to Sparta, they put a lip all the way across the bottom for the
Right.
Beast and the Super. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Like, wasn't that part of the challenge is to have to jump and catch the grip and pull yourself up? But now you can actually just stand on the lip and grab the hold. So I thought that was interesting. Um, but yeah, I think those are the only two that they really changed. And
Oh,
besides the spear having the target.
right, right. What are your thoughts? I hear, burpees coming back. What are your thoughts on being in the sport as long as you have to? Like, what are your thoughts on burpees versus the penalty loops for Spartan?
I understand why they did it because they're having a hard time finding enough volunteers, and there's too many variables, especially when you're
Right.
trying to judge burpees, especially if it's a very large competitive race. So to make a loop as a penalty makes it a lot easier to judge.
Yeah.
There's a lot less that you have to go back and look at if there is um, somebody that says, I did my burpee, but they didn't, whatever. But I do have to say that sometimes on some of the races, the penalty loops aren't a penalty. They're actually easier. People can do the penalty loop just as fast or faster than they can do the obstacle.
Hmm.
So if you're going to make it a penalty loop, make it a set distance, maybe a
Yes.
quarter mile, maybe through some terrain that actually challenges you, that slows you down to make you want to really make the obstacle. Um, Burpees on the spear, I think is great. But make sure that you have a judge there because they don't. And so it's very, you know, you could do two less or you could do two more and whatever, and nobody would know the difference. So, if you're going to bring the burpees back to certain obstacles, just make sure that you have, two or three volunteers there or judges that are actually watching it. But yeah, I think it's great. I think burpees are a lot harder than the penalty loop unless you make the penalty loop a set distance.
Right. Yeah, it does a good job of incentivizing the obstacle, but I completely agree. It's very hard to enforce a penalty, and then we see penalties on top of penalties, which is just kind of seems foolish a little bit. I was hearing reports of not many volunteers there, at least for the age group waves later on. How was the like officiating for like the elite wave that you ran?
There were some obstacles that still didn't have anybody on them. Honestly, they were pretty easy obstacles that not a lot of people failed. But still, if it's a competitive race, then there should be someone there watching.
Yeah.
The weather was kind of nasty on the second day, so maybe that was the reason why they didn't have as many volunteers out because it did get pretty cold. On the first day, it actually got kind of cold and windy uh, later in the afternoon. So I don't know, maybe that's the issue.
Yeah, maybe. Let's get into your races in particular. So how did your races go?
Oh, great. That was so fun. I loved it. Um, Funny because last year I didn't do so well. But this year I felt strong. I've been training. It was funny because at the end of the race on the beast, he asked me, he says, "Well, what did you do in your off season?" And I'm like, "What off season? Like, I don't have an off season.
Hmm.
You just keep racing, especially because we got weather like this."
Right.